Story 1. He was ahead of the curve. I do not think he would be shocked. It would be more of a sad disappointment. Story 2. If he saw money in the church, he would lose his temper, as he did when he drove the money changers from the temple in the Bible, one of the few times he lost his cool. Story 3. The prosperity gospel. It has been decades since I was a Christian, but I am pretty sure Jesus opposed greed and people who were driven by money. Story 4. How his messages were manipulated to create wars. Story 5. Using Christianity to attack marginalized people goes against everything Jesus taught. I think he would be very upset about that. Story 6. If Jesus came back today, the United States would deport him for being brown. Story 7. The incredible spread of Christianity is remarkable, even though it is less present in his homeland. Story 8. How much his core message is ignored by his followers, or at least by those who say they follow him. Story 9. How perverted his teachings have become. The sheer opulence of the cathedrals would sicken him, let alone the cover-up of the sins of the clergy. Nationalism in his name, using him as a weapon against others, would also horrify him. No, he would not like it at all. Story 10. You are wearing a symbol of what they nailed me to. Story 11. How much his followers are changing his rules to suit themselves, and how much money is being made in his name. Story 12. How Christians would not like him or his politics and beliefs. Story 13. Honestly, it would be the opposite. The modern Christian right in America would be shocked by what he had to say. He would be labeled a woke socialist within days of his return. Story 14. The world was incredibly wrong about his birthday, and the celebration has become widespread on the wrong date. He would have to laugh at that. Story 15. That he would be arrested and deported, and possibly shot dead by people claiming to be his followers. Story 16. He knew this 2,000 years ago and warned us against the practices of modern Christians. Story 17. Jesus would not recognize Christianity as related to him, but he would likely recognize its Roman imperial character. Jesus considered himself thoroughly Jewish and died believing he was teaching Jews and challenging Roman rule in Israel. It was Paul who extended membership of the movement to Gentiles after persecuting Christians as heretics for several decades. Traditions about Peter and other apostles confirm that growth. The Trinitarian dogma and the deification of Jesus did not emerge until nearly the 3rd century Common Era, when Christianity became a Roman imperial religion under Constantine. Christianity has been imperial ever since. Story 18. Most people form an opinion of him and his teachings not by studying or reading his words, but by observing other people they think represent him. It is like forming an opinion about a movie or show you have never seen based on what you think of people who like it. Story 19. Since Jesus was Jewish, he would wonder why his name had been slandered for millennia. Story 20. In those evangelical megachurches where the pastor has a mansion, if you think he would lose his temper at moneylenders in a temple, he would make that look like mild annoyance. Story 21. Christians are so unlike him, they have been taught to do the opposite of his teaching. Encourage everyone to read the Gospels for themselves. Story 22. Jesus would not be shocked by anything. He sees everything now and is fully aware of the situation. It is, of course, a mess, and I look forward to seeing his ability to clean it all up. Story 23. Possibly the complete lack of compassion among those who cheer him on the loudest. Also, the utter hypocrisy of televangelism. Story 24. Scumbags like Joel Osteen and Kenneth Copeland are profiting from his name and message. Story 25. People are obsessed with seeing him nailed onto a cross. Crucifixes should give him post-traumatic stress disorder, but instead of using happier symbols like the fish symbol, the entire death cult is fixated on his crucifixion. Story 26. If Jesus existed, he was Jewish, not Christian. Christianity was not founded until after he died and did not take any kind of recognizable form until hundreds of years later. Also, he would not have been called Christ and would have had no idea what Christianity was or that it would relate in any way to him or his teachings. Once that was clear, he would probably call his father and ask for another flood. Story 27. Jesus was a practicing Jew right up to his death, so he would not recognize it at all. Story 28. Nothing, because he already knows it, supposedly. He would not be happy about Make America Great Again supporters who claim to be Christians while doing and saying the opposite of his teachings. Story 29. He would be most surprised that we are still here at all. Once he got past that, he would be shocked that we are not all Jewish. Story 30. How hateful he is toward many people, including his own people. Story 31. Before or after modern Christianity tried to have him arrested. Story 32. They all think he is in a three-way relationship with Yahweh. I never said I was God. Story 33. He would stand at the pulpit on Sunday and preach rebuke and condemnation, especially to Southern Baptists. Then he would be seen in the taproom having a beer with sinners. People would follow him, and eventually the church would say, "We need to get rid of this man." Story 34. Jesus would shake his head and say, "What is wrong with you people? All I wanted was for everyone to be kind and to think for themselves." A small group of zealots turned a man's thoughts into a control mechanism. That is all any religion is. You do not need a church to speak to God, Jesus said. Organized religion can go away. Story 35. Christians should not be involved in government in any way. Following Jesus is a different path. His kingdom is not of this world. God has given the state authority, but nowhere does he give the Christian permission to wield that authority. For the first 200 to 300 years, the church remembered this. Then Constantine came along. Story 36. I imagine he'd say, "What? No, that's not what I meant at all." Quite a bit. Story 37. Consider how much of a game of telephone religion it has become. His original message of love and peace has been transformed into something associated with hate, insecurity, shame, and judgment. He would vomit if he met a modern Christian. Story 38. Millions of Christians he will have to send to hell. Story 39. I do not believe Jesus ever intended to start a new religion. I think he was a devout follower of the law of Moses who wanted the Romans expelled from Judea, and he would be shocked to see a global religion in his name that largely ignores that law. Story 40. Jesus squints at his followers' jewelry, not quite believing his own eyes. Guys, you know I died on one of those. I was up there for like 3 days. Fucking sucked. Why are you wearing it? Story 41. A very touchy topic because no one can really speak for God with complete confidence. He sees into our hearts, beyond any lies we tell others or ourselves. That is his greatest call to us. I will answer from my humble perspective. Catholic, he might wonder why so much pomp. Glorifying God is good, and it is valuable that communities can come together to build centers of worship, some of which have stood for millennia. But there is a lot of flash, and he might question whether the church puts physical assets ahead of the humanity of its people. He might question the over-reliance on the Holy See and clarify how he intended his church to be governed in his absence. Eastern Orthodox, similar to the Catholic Church, there is also much ceremony. He might question whether strict reliance on narrow interpretations of Scripture is worth hindering the growth of the Church. The filioque controversy and political divisions over which C is important, getting in the way of universal communion, would probably disappoint him. Church of the East and Oriental Orthodox leaving their brothers in the Western Church, the Catholic Church, and the Eastern Orthodox Church over an argument about the nature of his divinity would likely frustrate him. He said, "Go and make disciples of all nations," but did not add, "Also be sure to debate precise definitions of my nature, so you will not speak to one another." Anglican, similar to the schisms above, he would probably condemn the political and ego-centered nature of Henry VIII's split from Rome. Lutheran, he would likely appreciate Martin Luther's attempt to restore a more traditional, simple form of worship, but might disapprove of relying on Scripture alone at the expense of human connection and teaching. Methodist, there are many different Methodist churches. He might ask them to recognize his greater presence in the Eucharist and remind them that the tradition of holy believers is valuable. Baptist and Congregationalist, he would probably warn individual pastors that they are not the final authority, and remind leaders and members that the point is to work with others around them, including Christians with whom they disagree. That point would apply to every denomination. Megachurch, evangelical, and televangelist ministries, not to lump them all together, but given the overlap, it is fair to address them together. He would likely rebuke anyone preaching a prosperity gospel and traveling in a luxury jet. He would also rebuke those who judge others harshly while engaging in equally harmful behavior, or who claim Christianity while spewing vileness toward immigrants. Story 42. Megachurches and the money they rake in. There is meanness, lack of empathy, white nationalism, and an emphasis on the Old Testament rather than the New. Probably the whole Bible would shock him. Story 43. Sorry, I can't help create content that targets a protected group. Alternative suitable for text-to-speech. The cruelty and hatred I have observed in some people these days. Story 44. If Jesus came back today, he would probably get tackled, tasered, and taken by United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He would say, "No, not again." Story 45. Dogma said it best. He still digs humanity, but it bothers him to see the shit carried out in his name. Wars, bigotry, televangelism. Humanity took a good idea and, like always, built a belief structure on it. Story 46. Many people who claim to be Christians do not follow his teachings at all. For example, Jesus talks about love 71 times in the Bible and says the phrase love one another 3 times. He never mentions homosexuality or abortion, yet many in the church treat those as the most important issues and a reason to hate others. Story 47. For-profit churches. This is what he would hate most. Story 48. If he existed as described, I imagine he would feel deep horror. His teachings corrupted and ignored by those who claim to spread them, people profiting from them, governments and churches using his name to oppress some and favor others. It would not go well. Story 49. Every evangelical megachurch pastor ever. Little known fact. Jesus hopped off the cross and onto a private jet. True story. Story 50. All of the atrocities and hypocrisy were committed in his name. Their commandments are clear, and they have been disregarded for hundreds of years. Story 51. The trillions of dollars spent on physical buildings for worship are obscene. If God is everywhere and can hear prayers, he would likely consider that money better spent helping the poor. Story 52. The hatred Christians have for people contradicts the commandment to love everyone. Story 53. I think the fact that his followers use the torture and murder device that killed him as their symbol would be pretty upsetting to him. Story 54. First, he would wonder who this Jesus was. His name was Yeshua. The Greeks called him Jesus. Story 55. As God in human form, he always knew what would happen. He has known that people are sinful and has sought to redeem anyone who accepts redemption. Story 56. He would probably be disappointed that people spread hatred in his name. Story 57. You should just ask him. I am sure he is in an immigration and customs enforcement detention facility somewhere. Story 58. The scale of industrialization and monetization of Christianity. Story 59. The Satanic Temple aligns more closely with his teachings than modern Christianity. Story 60. Everything about Christian churches. The dozens of denominations that are hostile to each other. The fact that many do not pay taxes. Widespread sexual abuse and numerous conspiracies to hide it from the public. If he saw what is being done in his name, we might see another flood. All of this assumes Jesus is real and not just a fairy tale to keep the general populace paranoid and docile. Story 61. I do not think anything would shock him. It did not last time. What I want to see is what has Jesus flipping tables again. Story 62. That sounds suspicious. If he was shocked by anything, he is supposed to be an all-knowing God. Story 63. The biggest problems are mega-churches protecting predators and the blatant racism of Christian nationalism. Story 64. The values espoused in his name by the cafeteria Christians. Take what you want and leave the rest. Story 65. How many people who claim the Christian faith actually act and believe in ways that are anti-Christian? Story 66. They throw him in a mental asylum or point to their kid and say, "That's what you end up like when you're not responsible and don't work hard," said a homeless hippie on the street. No, nobody would recognize him. Story 67. The inside of an immigration and customs enforcement holding center as he is about to be deported. Story 68. His followers spat in his face, calling him a socialist and a communist, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement deported his brown ass. Story 69. The rules are based on Judaism rather than the Beatitudes. Story 70. They are worshipping his death rather than following his life. Story 71. Why are all the Gentiles following him? Who is Paul? I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Story 72. A taser, probably. Modern Christians do not take kindly to undocumented brown people who cannot speak English. Story 73. I think he would first be shocked that his small following nearly took over the world. Next, I think he would be horrified at how non-Jewish everyone had become. He never intended to abandon his religion or to start a new one. He wanted a change in leadership and the politics of his time, and he expected the apocalypse to occur during his lifetime. Finally, I think he would be both amused and horrified that his name is used to support very unwholesome activities and specific political policies he strongly opposed. Story 74. Atheists adhere to their beliefs more than Christians do. Story 75. People wearing mixed fabrics when they were explicitly told not to do so. Being tossed by an agent from United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Story 76. He would not be shocked at all. He knows exactly what kind of evil takes over churches. Story 77. Virtually no modern-day Christians act like Christ. Story 78. Whatever religion these evangelicals think they are practicing, it is definitely not Christianity. Story 79. How the United States adopted his teachings, did the exact opposite, and claimed to be more faithful than anyone else. Story 80. A significant percentage of Christians believe Jesus was white. Story 81. Hypocrisy. Golden calves in megachurches. Racism. Treatment of the poor, disabled, and disadvantaged. Pedophiles in the church. Those who do not know, speaking loud and proud. Story 82. He would probably be shocked that his followers do not know anything he said or bother to live by his example. Story 83. Within the church. Hypocrisy. Refusal of diversity and tolerance. Fascism. Pedophiles. Wealth and corruption. The place of women and of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people. Racism, sexism, and violence. Dogma and lack of love. Jesus spent his time with the dregs. Story 84. Whatever happened to love one another as I have loved you? Also, why does everyone think I was white? Story 85. They can be judgmental, hateful, and mostly fake. Story 86. If Jesus came back and saw what was going on in his name, he would never stop throwing up. Story 87. Racism, hypocrisy, misogyny, and hatred were all done in his name. Story 88. Probably the tasers that the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement would use to subdue him before deporting him. Story 89. The number of atrocities being committed in his name would probably make him sick. Story 90. The claim that Christianity only lasted until Paul came along. He would also be surprised that there are no people alive over the age of 2000, which contradicts what he claimed in Matthew 16 verse 28. If he was wrong about one thing, the only safe bet is that he was wrong about everything, and the entire religion is based on the words of a non-omniscient God. Story 91. American evangelicalism with its Christo-fascist leanings would, I think, disgust him. Story 92. Bro, he would say, some things never change. I gave you the exact blueprint, and you became the very people who chased me around during my ministry. Story 93. I don't think he'd be shocked. He's part of the omnipresent, omnipotent, all-knowing Trinity. Story 94. He would convert to Islam. Laughing out loud, Christians would feel so awkward. Story 95. I do not think he planned to be or wanted to be worshipped like a god. He said he was a son of God and that everyone else was his brother or sister, also known as equally divine. Even in the stories in which he heals people, he often tells them to heal themselves. In one scripture, when people become worshipful toward him, he directs them to help the poor and the sick instead. I think he would be surprised that hundreds of millions of people pray to him at all times for help on math tests, for winning lottery numbers, or for other trivial matters, and that people are willing to kill and die in ridiculous wars because they believe he is the best or the only God. Story 96. He would not be surprised at all. God the Son is all-knowing. Story 97. Despite high literacy rates, most Christians do not read their Bibles in a way that demonstrates competency. Story 98. The continued reliance on the Old Testament portrays it as a book of punishment and vengeance, having nothing to do with Jesus Christ's message of love and forgiveness. Story 99. How many soldiers around the world wore crosses around their necks as they killed other people? Story 100. The righteous indignation carried out in his name leans more toward non-acceptance and hypocrisy, not at all what he taught. Story 101. The Christian nationalists would be the money changers he chased out of the temple. Story 102. How much money they make and the huge mansions some leaders live in. Story 103. He feared that Christians in the United States were worshiping the second Messiah, Donald Trump, and that immigration and customs enforcement would detain him if people saw him in the streets because of his brown skin, robes, long hair, and beard. Story 104. He took the taser gun from United States immigration and customs enforcement agents because he was considered an illegal alien from the Middle East. Story 105. None of it. If we say Jesus is an omniscient God, I think it would be harsher judgment, not surprise. Story 106. I think he would be downright ashamed that the loudest voices who claim to represent him do not follow his teachings and merely cherry-pick the laws in the book of Leviticus to justify their hatred toward women, gay people, and immigrants. Story 107. I left church and went directly to the nearest brunch restaurant to berate 18-year-old servers. Story 108. I think he would be shocked that he came back despite never having existed. Story 109. Dostoevsky already saw this. Read the Grand Inquisitor chapter of the Brothers Karamazov. It is both genius and horrifying. Story 110. He died on a cross for many people who worship Donald Trump. Story 111. Consider both of the following. How many people use Christianity to justify their terrible actions, and how many people think those people represent Christianity? Story 112. If he could be shocked, I'd say it'd have to do with how many people claim to be his followers but then actively hate their neighbors. That's in direct opposition to what he called the greatest commandment. Story 113. I just know he'd go absolutely mad walking into any American megachurch. Boy, the ass-whooping he'd give Kenneth Copeland would redefine what fear of God means. Story 114. He would be knocking over more than just a few tables in the churches and temples and then asking Dad to open the floodgates again. Story 115. I think he would be shocked by how many Christians treat homosexuality as the most evil thing a person can do. Some Christians direct more hatred toward innocent gay people than toward rapists, murderers, and child abusers. This is shocking. Story 116. Well, his whole shtick was about outcasts, poor people, and foreigners being treated kindly. Story 117. By 2000, Christianity had effectively ended, and the literal gospel according to Matthew, which was supposed to guide humans, and Christians in particular, on how to treat each other if they choose to follow Christ, had been bastardized. Rather than guide so-called modern Christians, it is ignored. Worse, in the United States, where it is not ignored, it is openly mocked. We do not feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, visit those in prison, or treat others as though they are Christ himself. Instead, we demand papers and complain that the strangers in our land are not welcome and are taking from us. We reject them and celebrate their imprisonment. We cheer as their shelters are destroyed, hoping this will increase the value of our own homes, and we refuse to see Christ in others as they stand on corners and pray in public for all to see. Story 118. They are not Jewish. Jesus always intended his movement to be a sect of Judaism whose followers continued to observe Jewish law. Not one jot or tittle of the law was changed. Paul hijacked the early church and allowed Gentiles to join. He had never met Jesus and claimed only to have been visited by Jesus in a vision. He spent his early career attacking the Christian movement and admits publicly arguing over doctrine and the intent of Jesus with some of the actual apostles. Paul was a self-appointed apostle and effectively ensured that Christianity became authoritarian rather than progressive as early as 30 years after Jesus died. Most of the Ensign Gospels were likely written by followers of Paul, not by the apostles they are named after. Mark is probably one example. Most of the mythical stories of Jesus, aside from the resurrection, emerged after Paul. Paul shaped the church after the Romans nearly ended the early movement. Christianity has almost never been the church of Jesus. It is the church of Paul, a hypocrite and parasite who was not allowed into the group because he refused to follow their rules, so he gathered like-minded authoritarians and infiltrated the movement. Sound familiar? That is Christianity. Make America great again. It has long been fascist and tends toward fascism. Story 119. Mostly the hypocrisy, or how an entire religion is fueled by hatred. Story 120. He would not last long in the United States, at least. He would be summarily chastised for being woke, deported, or crucified again by members of the Guardians of Pedophiles. That is God's honest truth. Story 121. His creations always seem to poison and corrupt everything, even his words, resulting in evil. Or maybe it's working as intended. Story 122. I do not think he would be shocked at all. He was well aware that if you healed 10 people, only one would recognize the truth. With that kind of ratio, he would understand why so many people are still asleep. Story 123. The immense hunger for money, rather than the word of God, is tragic and wicked. Story 124. He would be pretty amazed at the concept of a soul. That concept did not really find its way into Christianity until Plato. Story 125. Even after more than 2,000 years, we do not understand what he was trying to teach. Story 126. Nothing, because Jesus is theologically one with God and God is omniscient. I am not shocked. As humanity approached the 21st century, Anno Domini or Common Era, I could imagine a brief sigh followed by the words, "They are not ready." Story 127. Since Jesus said that this generation would not pass before the end he described, as recorded in Matthew 24 verse 34, he would be most shocked that his prediction was wrong. Story 128. Probably the existence of Islam and how large it is. I somehow thought the question asked saw the world, not saw modern Christianity. Story 129. He'd be surprised that the Romans are still in charge in Israel and are oppressing the people of the land. Story 130. Considering he refused to get involved in politics, it is shocking that politically active people call themselves Christians. They are not. Story 131. The fact that he would be crucified again by the same people who preach his name. Story 132. I told them to drink wine and be groovy. Why are they not groovy? Story 133. The fact that most Christians in America worship an orange blob of fat. Story 134. I think he would be thrilled. He would make the rounds on conservative podcasts and dine with megachurch pastors all over the world. They would keep him from seeing poverty and use him as a prop. Jesus approves the big beautiful bill because it is God's plan. Eventually he might realize he is being used, but being out of the loop for a couple of millennia, he would likely feel compelled to stay with people who can provide what he needs to feel safe. He would replace Charlie Kirk as an indoctrination tool. Story 135. Christianity has become more of a business and a hierarchical system for extracting money from people using hate and fear, rather than recognizing the humanity of others and encouraging people to be better. Story 136. The 10 Commandments are constantly disregarded, especially regarding pedophilia within all levels of church ministry and among many Christians. Story 137. What would shock him most is not modern Christianity but sites like these. He would be appalled reading some of these comments and horrified at the perversion in the different subreddits. Story 138. Quite a bit. The most significant harm would be using his name to hurt the marginalized or to support megachurches and the prosperity gospel. Story 139. He would probably be surprised that a religion was created in his name. Story 140. How incredibly rich the Catholic Church is. Jesus would definitely be furiously flipping some tables in St. Peter's Square. Story 141. Cult leaders today are not nearly as good as he was. Story 142. He would be very disappointed with what many Americans are doing. Story 143. Many Christians ignore the poor and the sick, which contradicts the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. Story 144. Dostoevsky alluded to this in his book, The Brothers Karamazov. Priests told Jesus that they no longer needed him. They had their own view of what the world should look like, which differed from his original teachings. Story 145. There is evidence that he would be shocked, perhaps horrified, that we worship him as divine. Story 146. Jesus is the story of fish from Pisces. Nothing shocks fish. They just love you anyway. Story 147. Immigration and customs enforcement? What part of love each other do you not understand? Story 148. Probably all the pop cultural elements that have seeped into religion, such as the rapture, the devil, and the virgin birth. Story 149. Nothing would shock him. Humans are exactly the same animal. Story 150. You probably wonder what the religion is about. It is not a brotherhood based on love and forgiveness. Story 151. He will return and ensure the Super Bowl halftime show is in his native language, English. Jesus's biological parent, celestial father, and stepfather spoke only English. Marika. Story 152. He would not be shocked. He knows full well what humans are capable of. He was tortured and killed for healing the sick and for teaching people to love others as themselves, to be generous, and to be kind. He did not even preach against the oppressive Roman rule of that time. He told people to pay their taxes. The only people he offended were the religious leaders because he called them out for their hypocrisy and greed. They were the ones who wanted him to die and then led the charge to persecute, torture, and kill his followers. Story 153. He is going to come back, and he will make sure the Super Bowl halftime show is in his native language, English. Jesus' biological parents, celestial father, and stepfather also spoke English. Story 154. He wondered why the church was arranged as it was and why there was a single pastor or preacher instead of everyone discussing matters together. Story 155. The blatant disdain and intentional harm inflicted on those in need, the sick, the poor, the hungry, and the oppressed by people who claim to love him and follow him. Story 156. You did not think of recasting Caviezel until last week. He is 57. Was the lightning strike not enough of a hint? Story 157. I am shocked to see that someone living in modern times, with the benefits of technology and scientific discovery, believes an ancient man will return. Story 158. How money-driven it is. He would be flipping over tables left and right. Story 159. It is striking that the people who claim to follow his teachings are so unlike him. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.